The neighborhood had always been a quiet and well-kept place. The houses looked neat, the lawns were trimmed, and most people minded their own business. It wasn't a fancy, gated community, but the people living there took pride in keeping it safe and organized. Everyone paid their HOA fees, followed the basic rules, and things ran smoothly most of the time. One of the residents, a calm and hardworking man named David, had lived there for almost 6 years. He was the kind of neighbor who waved to everyone, helped shovel snow for the older folks, and never caused trouble. He worked as an engineer and believed in clean, renewable energy. So when he saved up enough money, he decided to install solar panels on his roof. He'd been thinking about it for years. Not only would it lower his electricity bill, but it would also help the environment. He even offered to share extra power with the neighborhood system that supported the streetlights, gates, and cameras. It was something that could benefit everyone. When the panels were installed, most neighbors congratulated him. Some even asked for the installer's number, thinking they might do the same in the future. The HOA board approved the installation since it followed all community guidelines. Everything was fine, at least for a few weeks. But then there was Karen. She was one of those neighbors who always needed to be in control. She had been on the HOA board for years, and many people said she treated it like her personal kingdom. She liked everything to be uniform, same paint colors, same mailbox style, same flower beds. If someone changed their porch light without her approval, she'd send them a warning letter. From the day David installed his panels, she started acting strange. At first it was small comments. She'd walk by his house, stop, and stare at the panels. Once she muttered something about them being an eyesore. Another time she told another neighbor that his roof looked like a junkyard. David tried to ignore her. He didn't want drama. He believed that in time she'd move on and find something else to complain about. But instead, things got worse. Karen started attending every HOA meeting with printed complaints. She said the panels reflected sunlight into her windows. She said they made the neighborhood look unbalanced. She even claimed they could cause property values to drop. Most of the board members didn't take her seriously because they knew she had a history of overreacting, but that didn't stop her. When the HOA didn't side with her, she started filing complaints directly with the city. Each time inspectors came, checked the installation, and said everything was legal and properly done. Every time, David remained polite, thanked them for their time, and went back to his day. Still, the tension grew. Neighbors started whispering about her obsession. Some joked that she needed a hobby. Others warned David to be careful because she wasn't the type to give up easily. Then one weekend, something happened that changed everything. David had gone out of town for 3 days to visit his brother. He'd asked a friend to keep an eye on the house, but the weather was calm, and everything seemed normal. While he was away, Karen noticed his car was gone. That was when she decided to make her move. Late at night, she walked into her backyard and climbed up a small step ladder to peek over the fence toward David's roof. The panels sat there catching the moonlight. In her mind, they didn't belong. She convinced herself that she was doing the neighborhood a favor by fixing the problem. The next morning, she went to the hardware store and bought several cans of thick black outdoor paint. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. That evening, when most people were inside, she dragged a ladder to the side of David's house and began climbing up. It wasn't easy, and she wasn't young anymore, but she was determined. She started painting over the solar panels one by one, covering the shiny surface with heavy strokes of black paint. In her mind, she thought she was making them less visible. But in reality, she was destroying them completely. It took her hours. The wind blew some paint drops across the siding and onto the driveway, but she didn't care. By the time she was done, her arms ached, and her clothes were covered in black stains. She climbed down, packed up her ladder, and went home feeling oddly proud of herself. The next morning, no one noticed anything. The neighborhood looked calm and quiet as usual. Karen smiled every time she walked past David's house. She thought she'd finally restored the neighborhood's charm. But that smile didn't last long. The solar panels weren't just for David's home. They also powered a shared backup battery that supplied electricity to the HOA's gate and security system. When those panels went offline, the neighborhood lost its backup source of power. It didn't show immediately, but within 24 hours, the system began to shut down piece by piece. First, the motion lights at the front entrance stopped turning on. Then the cameras near the gate started flickering. Finally, the electric gate that controlled vehicle entry froze. No one realized what was happening yet, but the small issues were starting to build up. When David returned 2 days later, the first thing he noticed was how hot his house felt. Usually his smart thermostat kept the temperature perfect, but now it wasn't responding. He tried to reset the system, but nothing worked. Then he went outside and looked up at his roof. He froze. His beautiful solar panels, which once reflected the sun like glass, were now completely black. At first he thought maybe it was dust or soot from a fire, but as he got closer he realized it was paint. Thick, sticky, and deliberately applied. His stomach dropped. He took a few steps back and just stared. It was unbelievable. Someone had done this intentionally. His heart raced as he looked around, but there were no signs of forced entry, just paint stains on the ground and ladder marks on the wall. The first thing he did was call the police. They told him to take photos and file a report. He also called the HOA to inform them of the damage. The HOA president sounded shocked but said they'd need to look into it. Within an hour, word spread across the community chat group. People were shocked and curious. Some even walked by to see the damage. That evening, a neighbor came by and quietly told David that they'd seen Karen outside his house late one night while he was gone. She'd been holding a flashlight and something that looked like a paint can. David didn't want to believe it. It sounded too crazy even for her. But as more people started talking, it became clear that she was the only one who could have done it. The same night, the neighborhood faced another problem. The electric gate refused to open. Several cars were stuck outside, honking and calling the HOA for help. The security system went down completely. The streetlights began flickering and even the community alarm system lost power. People were frustrated and confused. The HOA board called an emergency technician, who checked the main control system. He said the problem came from the power source. The solar supply was offline. That was when everything clicked. Karen, in her attempt to fix what she thought was ugly, had actually cut power to the entire neighborhood's backup system. The same panels she hated so much were the reason their security worked in the first place. David couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying everything in his head, her constant complaints, her threats at meetings, the late-night ladder marks, and now the blackout. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted things to go back to normal. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The damage wasn't just about a few panels or a lost weekend. What she had done was serious, and soon the whole neighborhood would realize just how much one person's bitterness could affect everyone else. The next morning, David stood outside staring at his roof again, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Neighbors walked by, giving him sympathetic looks. The HOA president called and said there would be a meeting that afternoon to discuss what had happened. David didn't know what to expect. But one thing was certain. The peace that once filled the neighborhood had been replaced by tension and suspicion. And the person behind it all had no idea how much chaos she had just started. When David woke up the next morning, the air in the house still felt heavy and warm. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept seeing the image of his roof, those black, ruined panels that once gave him so much pride. He couldn't understand why anyone would do something like that. He made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, trying to think clearly. The neighborhood looked peaceful from where he sat, but underneath that quiet calm, something felt wrong. It wasn't just about the damage anymore. It was the idea that someone he knew, someone he saw almost every day, had climbed onto his property and destroyed something that wasn't theirs. After finishing his coffee, he went outside with a ladder and climbed up to inspect the panels more closely. The black paint was thick and sticky, dried hard by the sun. He tried scratching a corner with a small scraper, but it wouldn't come off easily. He sighed, knowing that professional help would be needed to clean or maybe even replace them. As he worked, a few neighbors stopped by. One of them, a kind elderly man who lived 2 houses down, shook his head sadly. He said he'd seen Karen walking around late at night while David was gone. She had a flashlight and was standing close to his fence. He didn't think much of it then, but now everything made sense. David thanked him for sharing that information. Another neighbor mentioned that Karen had been complaining about the panels again during her evening walk, saying they were an eyesore. It was clear now that she had been planning this for a while. He went back inside and called the police again to give them an update. The officer on the line sounded patient but firm. He said they'd add the new information to the report and send someone to take a closer look. They told him to avoid cleaning the panels until the investigation was done. By noon, the whole neighborhood knew what had happened. The group chat was full of messages, some shocked, some angry, and a few trying to stay neutral. But one thing everyone agreed on was how strange it was that the security system had stopped working the same day the panels were damaged. A few people complained that their security cameras weren't recording anymore. Others said the gate had stopped responding to key fobs. Some even had to park their cars outside the entrance and walk in. The HOA started getting dozens of calls, and soon they scheduled an emergency meeting for that evening. When the afternoon came, the air felt tense. People gathered in the small community hall talking in low voices. The HOA president looked exhausted as she tried to calm everyone down. David arrived quietly and sat near the back, not wanting to cause a scene. Then Karen walked in. She had her usual confident stride, wearing large sunglasses even though they were indoors. She smiled and greeted a few people like nothing had happened. When she sat down, a few neighbors turned away from her. The room felt heavy with awkward silence until the HOA president stood up to begin the meeting. They started by addressing the main issue, the power and security outage. The technician they had hired earlier that day explained that the backup power source, which came from David's solar panels, was no longer generating energy. Without that, the security system couldn't stay online. David listened quietly as people started murmuring. Then the technician added that the panels weren't malfunctioning. They had been vandalized. That's when all eyes turned toward him. He stood up slowly, holding a folder in his hand. Inside were photos he had taken of the panels and the paint drips near the wall. His voice was calm but steady as he explained what had happened. He mentioned that the police had already taken a report and that he had evidence pointing toward who might be responsible. When he mentioned Karen's name, a few people gasped. Karen quickly raised her hand, pretending to look shocked. She laughed a little and said it was ridiculous to accuse her without proof. She claimed she had been at home the whole weekend and that the real issue was that David's panels shouldn't have been allowed in the first place. The HOA president frowned and reminded her that the installation had been approved months ago. Another neighbor spoke up and said they had seen her near David's property at night. Then the elderly man who had told David earlier also stood up and confirmed the same thing. Karen's face changed. She tried to laugh it off, saying they must have been mistaken. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she sounded. The president said the HOA would review the evidence and cooperate with the police. For now, Karen was suspended from her HOA duties until the situation was resolved. That decision made her furious. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room stayed silent for a few seconds after she left. People looked at each other, unsure of what to say. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached David. Some apologized for not believing him sooner. Others offered to help clean the panels once the investigation was done. It felt good to know that most people were on his side, but deep down he still felt tired and frustrated. That night he sat on his porch, staring at the dark street ahead. Usually by that hour the motion lights along the sidewalk would glow softly, but now everything was dark. The silence was unsettling. He could hear faint voices from nearby houses, dogs barking in the distance, but something about the night felt different, less safe. Around midnight, he got a call from the HOA president. She said that several residents were reporting new issues with the power system. Even the main gate had stopped responding completely. Delivery trucks couldn't get in or out, and a few residents who came home late were stuck outside. She asked if David's system could be reconnected manually, but he told her the panels were too damaged to produce any energy. It would take days, maybe weeks, to repair them. There was nothing he could do. The next morning, chaos began. People were frustrated, some even angry. Without the security system, the gate stayed open most of the time, which made residents nervous. Packages went missing from porches and someone's car was scratched overnight. Everyone blamed the HOA, but deep down they all knew where the problem had started. Karen stayed quiet for the first day, but soon she began telling neighbors that the outage wasn't her fault. She even claimed David was exaggerating to make her look bad, but her words carried little weight now. People had seen enough to know the truth. David spent the day calling insurance and repair companies trying to find someone who could fix the panels. The quotes he got were high, thousands of dollars for cleaning, maybe even more if replacement was needed. It wasn't just about money. It was the sense of violation that hurt him most. In the evening, a few neighbors came over to check on him. One of them, a young couple who lived across the street, brought dinner and sat with him on the porch. They talked about how the neighborhood had changed since the power went out. It wasn't just the lights, it was the feeling of safety that had disappeared. David listened quietly, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. He never wanted trouble with anyone. All he wanted was to do something good, for himself and for the community. Now that simple act had turned into a storm of conflict. Later that night, while sitting in his living room, he heard a noise outside. It was faint, like footsteps near the side of his house. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out carefully. The sound stopped. He shined the light around but saw nothing except shadows moving with the wind. It reminded him how vulnerable the neighborhood had become without the security system. Before, cameras would have caught every corner, and motion lights would have scared anyone away. But now, everything was dark. As he stood there looking around, he realized that this wasn't just about his panels anymore. This was about the entire community. One person's selfish act had put everyone at risk. The next morning, the HOA president called another meeting. The neighborhood couldn't function like this much longer. They needed a solution fast, and everyone knew it. The repairs would take time, and there was no backup system left. David agreed to share all his evidence with the police and the HOA. He didn't want to make it personal. He just wanted accountability. As he hung up the call, he glanced out his window once more. The panel sat there lifeless under the sun, covered in black paint that shimmered slightly as the light hit it. It was strange. Something that was supposed to capture sunlight now reflected nothing but darkness. And though David didn't know it yet, the worst was still to come. Because before the neighborhood could fix what had been broken, something unexpected would happen that would shake everyone to the core. The morning after the second HOA meeting, the neighborhood didn't feel the same. The air was quiet but tense, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. People who once greeted each other with smiles now looked over their shoulders before speaking. The whole community was on edge. David woke up early, made a cup of coffee, and stood by the window watching a few neighbors walking their dogs. Normally, he liked mornings like that. The soft sunlight, the sound of birds. But now it only reminded him of the ruined panels sitting useless on his roof. He had another long day ahead. The repair team he'd called earlier was supposed to stop by to inspect the damage. He was hoping they could clean the paint, but deep down, he feared the panels might be permanently damaged. Around 10 o'clock, a white service van pulled up. 2 technicians got out and began setting up their equipment. David showed them the panels, explaining what had happened. They climbed up, took a few samples, and began testing small sections with special cleaning fluid. After about half an hour, one of them climbed down inside. He explained that the type of paint used wasn't just any outdoor paint. It was a heat-resistant, industrial-grade coating. It had bonded with the surface and hardened in the sun. Even if they managed to clean it, the panels wouldn't perform like before. David felt his stomach twist. He asked if replacing them was the only option. The technician nodded. It would cost several $1,000s, and the process could take weeks. He thanked them for their honesty and watched as they packed up their gear and left. He sat on his porch after they were gone, staring at the quiet street. The HOA president had said they'd cover part of the damage if it was proven that a board member was responsible. But until then, he was on his own. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his neighbors. Someone had seen Karen outside again, talking to people near the gate. The message said she was telling others that David was exaggerating the situation to get sympathy and make her look bad. David put his phone down and rubbed his temples. He was tired of the drama, but part of him knew that people like her didn't stop until they were forced to. That evening, the HOA held another emergency meeting. The situation was getting worse. The technician who maintained the neighborhood's security system reported that most of the cameras were offline, and the backup batteries were empty. The electric gate had to be kept open because it wouldn't respond to the control system anymore. Residents complained about feeling unsafe. One woman said her motion lights no longer worked, and another said her package had gone missing the night before. People were angry and many wanted answers. The HOA president asked everyone to stay calm and explained that they were waiting for the police to complete their investigation. But patience was running out. Karen was sitting near the front, her arms crossed tightly. She didn't speak until the end, but when she did, her voice carried across the room. She said the neighborhood shouldn't have depended on one person's solar system and that it was irresponsible to connect private property to community infrastructure. The president reminded her that the board had approved the connection and that David's panels had saved the neighborhood hundreds of dollars in energy costs every month. Karen rolled her eyes and said she didn't believe it. Then David stood up. His voice was calm but steady. He explained again how the system worked, how it benefited everyone, and how what happened wasn't just vandalism. It was a threat to everyone's safety. He mentioned the technician's findings about the paint, how it was industrial grade and that this wasn't an accident. Karen interrupted, saying he had no proof she did it. She said anyone could have climbed his roof, but her tone gave her away. The more she spoke, the more people began to see the truth. One of the older residents raised his hand and said he had seen Karen walking around with a paint can the night David was away. He said she told him she was touching up something on her fence, but the timing now made sense. The room went quiet. The HOA president said they would hand everything over to the police and cooperate fully. She then looked directly at Karen and said that if it turned out she was responsible, she'd be removed from the HOA board permanently. Karen didn't respond. She just gathered her things and walked out again, slamming the door as she went. After the meeting, several neighbors stayed behind to talk. People were starting to realize how serious the situation was. Without the security cameras, anyone could walk in or out of the neighborhood. Some residents even said they'd seen strangers parked near the gate late at night. That same night, something unexpected happened. It was almost midnight when David heard loud knocking on his door. It was one of his neighbors, out of breath and nervous. He said someone had tried to open his garage door while he was inside watching TV. When he looked out the window, he saw a shadowy figure running toward the street, disappearing into the darkness. David grabbed a flashlight and went outside with him. The street was dark since the lights were still out, and the gate was wide open. They couldn't see anyone, but there were fresh footprints near the sidewalk. Other neighbors came out after hearing the noise. Everyone stood around talking, some scared, some angry. They called the police, who arrived a few minutes later. The officers took statements and walked around with flashlights but didn't find much. They said it might have been a random intruder taking advantage of the broken security system. As the police left, one of the officers turned to David and said quietly that whoever damaged the panels had put the whole neighborhood at risk. He told him to be careful. David didn't sleep that night. He sat by his window watching the dark street. Every little sound made him jump. He couldn't believe that just a few weeks ago everything had been peaceful and quiet. Now people were afraid to even go to bed. The next morning, the HOA president sent out a notice saying they were holding a vote to remove Karen from the board immediately. The neighborhood had lost too much because of her actions, and no one wanted her representing them anymore. Karen didn't take it well. She went door to door, trying to convince people she was being unfairly targeted, but most residents didn't want to talk to her. Some closed their doors. Others ignored her completely. By the end of the day, the vote was complete. The HOA officially removed her from her position. The message spread quickly across the neighborhood group chat. Some people celebrated quietly while others just felt relieved, but for David it didn't bring much comfort. His panels were still ruined, the security system was still down, and the feeling of peace in the neighborhood was gone. He decided to take one final step. He contacted a lawyer to discuss his options. The lawyer told him that since he had clear evidence and multiple witnesses, he had a strong case. They could file for property damage and possibly seek compensation for the HOA's losses too. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Someone had crossed a line and it couldn't be ignored. That evening, as David walked down the street, he noticed how quiet everything was. The gate still stood open and the cameras above it hung uselessly, covered in dust. He could hear kids playing somewhere in the distance, but there was a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. A few neighbors came out and thanked him for standing up for what was right. One of them said they were planning to help him start a fundraiser to repair the panels. It wasn't much, but the gesture warmed his heart. He realized that despite all the trouble, most of the people around him were good, kind neighbors who just wanted to live in peace. It was only one person's bitterness that had poisoned that peace. That night, David sat on his porch again, watching the stars. He thought about how strange it was that something meant to capture light had caused so much darkness. But he also knew that the truth had a way of coming out, no matter how long it took. The investigation was still ongoing and the repairs would take time. But one thing was clear: the neighborhood would never be the same again. And before the week was over, something else would happen that would finally expose everything in the most unexpected way possible. The next morning started quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the security system, the faint clicks from the cameras, the subtle buzz of the solar inverter, all gone. David didn't notice it at first. He was making his usual coffee when his phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor, Linda. Her message read, "Hey, do you know why the security app isn't showing anything?" "My cameras are offline." He frowned and opened his own app. The entire screen was blank. No connection. He stepped outside and looked up at his roof. His heart dropped. The panels, his pride and investment, were completely blacked out with some sort of coating. It wasn't just dust or shade. Someone had physically covered them. He climbed up to get a closer look and found it wasn't paint, but a heavy, sticky tarp-like film stretched over the panels and secured tightly with adhesive straps. It must have taken someone hours to do this. He knew right away who would go that far. Karen. She had been complaining for weeks about the reflection glare from his solar panels, even though they faced away from her house. The HOA had dismissed her complaint several times, but she wasn't the type to let things go. He was furious but decided not to act out of anger. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, every inch of it, every detail. He even took a short video showing how it blocked sunlight from reaching the panels. Then he called the local maintenance company that had installed them. They confirmed that removing the covering would require professional tools because the adhesive could damage the glass if peeled the wrong way. By the time the crew arrived, several neighbors had come outside. Everyone had the same problem. Their power backup wasn't working. The neighborhood's security system relied on David's solar setup. It powered the shared streetlights, the gate cameras, and the motion sensors around the sidewalks. Now, nothing worked. The gates were open, cameras were dead, and everyone was exposed. Linda came over, shaking her head. "It's chaos out here. I can't believe she did this. Who even does that?" David stayed calm. "I'll fix it, but I'm not letting this slide." When the maintenance team started peeling the covering off, one of them found something strange. On one of the straps was a small sticker from a local hardware store. David's heart skipped. He remembered seeing Karen there just 2 days ago when he was buying lawn fertilizer. He asked the worker to keep the sticker and receipt number safe. That was evidence. By evening, the panels were clean again and the sun finally powered up the system. But the damage was already done. Hours of power loss had triggered multiple issues around the neighborhood. Alarms had reset, and one house even had its fridge malfunction from the outage. David sat at his kitchen table that night staring at the photos. He didn't want to involve the police yet. He wanted to be absolutely certain before making that call. He decided to check his own camera footage from before the blackout. Since his home had internal memory storage, he connected directly to the system. It took hours of scanning, but then he found it. Around midnight the night before, a figure in a hooded jacket was climbing his fence. The person moved cautiously, looking around, then climbed onto the roof with a roll of black material. The movements were slow and calculated, but one moment, the figure looked up and the porch light caught her face for a split second. It was Karen. David leaned back in his chair, half in disbelief, half in anger. She wasn't just petty. She had deliberately sabotaged something that affected the whole community. The next morning, he walked straight to the HOA office with his phone, photos, and a copy of the maintenance report. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, looked uneasy as he scrolled through the footage. "This is serious," he said quietly. "This isn't just a neighbor dispute. This borders on property damage and public safety interference," David nodded. "And I want the board to handle it properly this time. She's gone too far." The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening. Almost every homeowner attended. The tension was thick. When Karen arrived, she walked in with that same smug look she always had, pretending she didn't know why everyone was there. The president played the video on the big screen. Gasps filled the room. Karen's smirk vanished. She immediately started talking over everyone. That video's fake. He edited that. He's been harassing me for weeks. But her words didn't match the evidence. The timestamp, the camera angle, the hardware sticker, all of it lined up perfectly. David didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You risked everyone's safety because you didn't like seeing my panels shine for 2 hours a day." Karen crossed her arms and tried to play the victim, talking about light pollution and privacy concerns. But by then, everyone had seen the truth. Mr. Thompson spoke firmly. The board has no choice but to issue fines for property damage and violation of community safety rules. You'll also need to pay for all the repair costs and service disruptions. Karen turned red. You can't do that. I'll sue this entire board. But nobody backed her up this time. Even the people who usually stayed quiet were shaking their heads. After the meeting, David went home feeling relieved but still uneasy. Something told him it wasn't over. People like Karen rarely stopped after being called out. They found new ways to strike back. Later that night, as he checked his porch lights, he noticed a faint sound near his fence. It was like something scraping metal. He walked over quietly and saw a shadow moving on the other side. He flicked on his flashlight and the figure darted away. He couldn't see who it was, but the direction they ran toward was Karen's house. He didn't chase after them. Instead, he went back inside and checked his cameras again. This time, he made sure all angles were covered, especially toward her property line. The following morning, he woke up to something new. Black paint splattered on his driveway, spelling out the words, "Mind your own business." That was the moment he knew this wasn't about solar panels anymore. It was about control. Karen couldn't stand losing, and now she was desperate to make him pay. But David wasn't the kind of person to back down from doing what's right. He took more photos, saved everything, and called the HOA again, requesting another meeting. This time he wasn't coming alone. He had already reached out to a local journalist who had covered similar neighborhood conflicts before. She was interested in doing a story, not to humiliate anyone, but to highlight how HOAs could sometimes protect the wrong people until things got out of control. When he mentioned this to the board, their tone changed. They didn't want the bad publicity. They promised to handle it quickly, but David could see they were scared too. By the end of that week, the HOA sent Karen a formal letter. She was facing multiple fines, mandatory cleanup orders, and a temporary suspension from attending HOA meetings due to disruptive behavior. But just as things started to calm, something unexpected happened that took everything to another level. And this time, it affected the entire neighborhood once again.